we'll go ahead and get started right now. We'll go through some housekeeping before we get into the content. We'll make sure to get through the content around 40 minutes in to give you guys plenty of time to do Q&A. There's a Q&A section where we encourage all of our attendees to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we will address that at the end of the webinar. The webinar will also be recorded and sent out within 48 hours after a little bit of editing. So you will have that in your inbox in addition to information from each of our expert panelists about the companies that they're representing. For more information on beeswax, visit beeswax.com. Feel free to email Ari at beeswax.com. For the Programmatic Advisory, programmaticadvisory.com or wayne.blodwell at theprogrammaticadvisory.com. And for Labmatic, labmatic with a K.com and tom.triscari at labmatic.com. So I'll give each of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and the company that they're representing. And this will give you guys a bit of a background on why they're here and why they're representing each of the different parts, strategy, resources, and technology for this webinar. I'll go right ahead and hand it off to Ari Paparo.
Hi, everybody. This is Ari Paparo. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Beeswax. Happy to have you all joining our webinar. Beeswax is a highly customizable and transparent buying platform. We innovated the bidder as a service, which allows customers to have their own DSP in the cloud. So looking forward to talking more about this. Thanks,
Ari. Over to you, Wayne.
Hi everyone, I'm Wayne Blodwell, the CEO and founder of the Programmatic Advisory. The Programmatic Advisory is an expertise consultancy in programmatic. Our goal is to transform marketing using data and tech. We primarily work with advertisers, and over the past year and a half, we've definitely seen an uptake in the number of advertisers considering bringing some of that capability into their businesses. So looking forward to chatting about that today.
Thanks, Wayne, and over to you, Tom.
Thanks, Julia, and to Beeswax for hosting this great webinar. I think it will be a great discussion, as it was this morning with the EMEA webinar. That was fantastic. And so Labmatic, we call ourselves the Programmatic Transformation Consultancy for the past several years now, and since our beginning, we have been running a practice area that's called Programmatic Resource Planning. We work only with brands to help them with the rest of the ecosystem, be it agencies, publishers, ad tech. And generally what we're doing across our engagements are investment case financially modeling, technology selection, process engineering, and talent development. We also do quite a bit of education along the way, which has a lot to do with change management as brands consider or implement going in-house. And then the key is really the implementation of whatever model they choose and to get it right, to put brands in control and to advance their operating capabilities with programmatic to advance their business objectives.
Great, thanks, Tom. So if you look at the agenda really quick, we're going to be covering the strategy, the resources, and the technology to really make in-housing programmatic successful for your organization. Before we do that, one other housekeeping note, we do have 3 panelists in 3 different locations, so we will be handing over control of the slides at different portions of the webinar, so bear with us as we change those slides. But before we get into the actual content, there were a few questions that I did want to ask the panelists in order to level set the playing field here and make sure that we're all on the same page as to what we're actually talking about. So I'll go ahead and ask this to Ari. What exactly, in your opinion, does in-housing programmatic mean for an organization?
Sure, it's a great question. And I think some of the presentations hope to address this, but it really varies quite a bit based on the marketer's needs and strategy. As shown in this slide, it really is about aligning the strategy, the resources, and the tech towards an activity that makes sense. So this can range from just signing paperwork with the DSP and having the contract in the marketer's name through full in-housing and replacing agencies and other service providers, or somewhere in between.
Great. And Wayne, what would you say have been the key drivers of this trend across the industry?
I think there are probably 2 biggest drivers. I think one is definitely commercial transparency. because there's a large belief from advertisers that when they buy through third parties or through third-party providers, they don't get to see what costs are going where. And then I think the second big driver is around strategic importance. So marketing in general has become more important to businesses so they can gain share of the markets or retain customers. So the smart marketers are using it for growth, and they're seeing the way you deliver that growth is through programmatic. So it's putting data and tech at the heart of what you do and enabling channels and formats and decisions around that. And I think they want to take control of that so they have more say over how decisions are made in sort of marketing.
Great, thank you. And Tom, I know I asked you this question earlier, but I think it plays nicely into the content that you'll be speaking about later. A recent ANA report indicated that 35% of brands expanded their in-house programmatic media buying capabilities. Do you see this trend continuing, and if so, why?
Yes, thanks, Julia. We certainly do see the trend continuing, probably into maybe something that should maybe in 2018 be called the new norm. The reason why, I think for some of the reasons that Ari mentioned and that Wayne had mentioned, one, the economics make a tremendous amount of sense, right? If your working media is really low because you don't have control over your supply chain, then getting working media right is very important. So there's a huge financial incentive, particularly when you're spending anywhere north of 10 million a year, and some brands are spending in the hundreds of millions a year programmatically. So there's a huge financial incentive there. That's the foundation. But the bigger reason should be to use these tools to do better advertising. Going back 3 years ago, we used to say, look, programmatic is just a new way to get an old job done. So if it can get the job done better than the old way, then it's a great new alternative. But it can't be that alternative if money is wasted on too many hops down the supply chain because of governance issues, etc. So overall, brands taking it in-house to do something better, to make their advertising better, it makes tremendous sense across the board.
Totally agree. Thanks, Tom. I'm going to stop sharing now and allow Wayne to get right into the strategy and talk about how the programmatic advisory helps brands come up with the most appropriate strategy for in-housing programmatic.
Great, thanks, Julia. So I guess the first thing I want to start with is when we talk about programmatic, I'd say previously when advertisers thought about in-housing programmatic, what they meant was bringing in a DSP, hiring a smart grad and running some campaigns. But actually now the programmatic ecosystem's evolved, there's actually a consideration that programmatic can enable the transactions and decisions made in more than just display buying. So of course, display is a primary programmatic channel. We've also seen mobile and video. Those three in particular have become largely programmatically enabled. More so now, we see some elements of social, mobile and app. Online search could be categorized as programmatic with data and tech. But looking forward, you've got to think about TV and radio and print and outdoor. And earlier I was talking to somebody about programmatic podcasts. So for an advertiser to start thinking about from a strategic perspective, if they want to bring programmatic into their organization, they have to consider that there's more than just running some highly targeted display banners. There's a whole world of opportunity and a whole world of new things they have to consider. So when we speak to advertisers about in-housing, we sort of talk about this 4-step process, starting from the bottom up. So the first thing is, do you spend enough? So firstly, here we put a benchmark of $20 million. To be honest, that's just a benchmark. You could be above and below depending on the markets and the brands. But by and large, you're going to start bringing in a lot of cost into your business to take on the technology, to take on maybe some data acquisition costs, to take on the media buying, and also to take on the talent. So that cost has to, once you look at the return, has to outweigh. So we do a lot of work with advertisers to look at when does it become cost positive, when does it return. The second part is talent. So actually what we found with some largely digital first businesses is they already have some of the talent in-house because they've either created social as a team internally or maybe even search. So maybe there's an opportunity to bring some of that talent across. And then second to that is, are you able to attract the talent? And that's quite challenging. If you're based in random locations in the UK or in the US, some brands really struggle to acquire that talent. The third part is measurement. So if advertisers are going to start in housing, they become far more accountable. And what I mean by that is, today, if an advertiser uses an agency and something goes wrong or campaigns aren't working, they can just pick up the phone, speak to their least favorite agency person, and have a bit of a moan. But now it's them there internally. And the way to sort of always avoid that conflict is to have fundamental effectiveness measurement in place. That way the results will do the talking. So measurement's really important. And then finally, technology, which we'll come on to in detail later with Ari and Tom. But if you're a multi-market brand, say you operate in 20 markets, and every market uses different tech, from an ad server through to CRM to measurement, that there's a priority number one is to get that more consolidated, because in-housing programmatic in that environment is super challenging to connect all these disparate systems and contracts, etc., and teams into kind of an in-house environment. So these are the sort of the four consideration points when we speak to advertisers we're kind of thinking about. And if you can sort of tick off each of those, you are then in the position, we think, to start actually considering creating that team. And that team was kind of built around, in-house is built around 5 pillars, which is the data. So can you collect it? Do you have enough of it to make good decisions in buying? The technology, which is what underpins everything and enables it to transact and flow. We spoke about just now about measurement around, are you going to measure success internally? Talent, could you get the right people? And then commercially, can you make it back out? And I think if we look back a couple of years ago when we heard the term in-housing, I think the perception was an advertiser would take all of this and bring it completely into their business. But I think through just natural evolution, we've seen that hasn't necessarily been the case. So in-housing, those 5 pillars, isn't a binary in-house or out-house. It actually can be a mix of both. And Tom will come into more detail about this, about people particularly. But if you think about data, you've got data from your own partners. So if you're at FMCG, you might have major grocers. You've got maybe some internal insight on consumers. You've got your own assets, that could be your app or your website. But actually, your agency may have some custom segments from their own proprietary data they may give to you. So in that case, that's not in-house. And similarly to tech, we've seen lots of enterprise brands in-house data management platform, a DMP, but they've started to in-house DSP contracts, started to take greater ownership of brand safety for obvious reasons. And then, but some of that technology like media buying to transact TV spot buys or outdoor or radio, that still does largely exist with an agency. And measurement, as I said, might have an in-house team or you might have some global dashboards to surface that. Talent perspective, you may have in-house, but you still may have other options outside that from agencies. And then commercially, which is, I think, was an initial trigger for in-housing, was that advertisers wanted to contractually own every part of this. So what kind of delivers all of this is what we call a programmatic process. So in the first instance, if you're setting up an in-house team, from a strategic perspective, you've got to think about your data. So your first-party data, any data you might get through partners, and then the third-party open marketplace. What that should do is help generate insight, and that insight is delivered through different data platforms. And what it should allow us to then do is segment that data into targetable audiences. That allows you to then overlay dynamic creative or some form of tailored message into your programmatically enabled channels. And then finally, you create a feedback loop for measurement. So when we sort of talk about to advertisers, we sort of put this in front of them and start thinking about, okay, what's really important to have internally? Largely, it starts with data platforms. and then what's second to that, and what else could you bring in and start to plug together in this sort of process. So to summarize kind of my section, it's really important that advertisers consider that programmatic is extending into other mediums, but those mediums are doing it in unique and wonderful ways and at their own pace. And advertisers need to be aware that that brings extra requirements. The in-house model needs to be commercially viable, and the advertisers need to find the right model for them. And here I put be realistic, because some advertisers consider we want everything internally, a team of 50. But in reality, if you're based out in the sticks, it can be quite hard to hire. So you want to find a model which works for you. And then finally, make sure you have the tech backbone and the resource structure scenarios planned and costed before you start, just to make sure that it can become commercially viable. And that's it in my section, and I look forward to the Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Wayne. Fantastic. So I will hit on the implementation part, or the resources needed to go in-house, which can come in various shapes and forms and operating models. There's lots of models to choose from. You'll see that theme throughout. Before I get into that, though, just want to level set our view on in-house, a little bit deeper into why it's happening across three themes. So the first thing is that to always remember that it's a means to an end. It's not the end itself. If you kind of go back 2 years ago, there was a lot of trade press articles and opinions out there at trade shows around, oh, don't go in-house, be fearful of going in-house. And in-house is about taking control, and control is about information. Right? So in running up to this in-house shift that marketers are going through, information was not shared as much as needed, and therefore it was hard for marketers to make the right decisions. And so that's a key thing to understand. It's also about cost reduction. The finances make tremendous sense. The more you spend in digital, which of course the bigger share of that is becoming programmatic, the more important that becomes. And then finally, with really good foundations on working media and the supply chain, you can build upon that to execute more advanced use cases and actually get the real measurement that marketers are really looking for around the promise of programmatic, to measure the things that drive their business. The second area is looking at this market as two markets and two speeds, right? So you have one part of the market which hasn't gone in-house yet, but maybe they're thinking about it. That's the 65% that Julia referenced from the ANA survey. And then the other 35%, they've already gone in-house in some way, shape, or form. But what does that mean, right? We think today that there's a big chasm to cross, to go from in-house 1.0 to in-house 2.0, right? So in-house 1.0, it's largely a substitute across the board. It's a substitute for what marketers were leaning on before, regarding whether it was agency managed service or account service or DSP managed service. And then it's getting towards using in-house as an alternative to get the advertising job done in a significantly better way. So there's a big difference between those two things. Lastly, there's a framework, I think, out there that explains a lot of why in-house has happened. It's called The Nature of the Firm. It was a paper written in 1937 by a Nobel laureate. He won a Nobel for this paper in part. His name was Ronald Coase. And the facts are that the costs for talent and tech to go in-house are relatively low, despite what is printed out there in the trade press. If you really look for something, you can find it in markets today, right? Contracting costs are also quite low, right? To onboard the contract for a DSP or a DMP or a verification vendor, it's quite low. You have to go through the normal legal and procedural channels, but it's quite low. It's the coordination costs that are quite high in the world today in the status quo model, right? Because there's so many disparate parts, so many people involved, even at a single campaign level, and programmatic is complex. And I think, as Ari mentioned earlier in the previous webinar with Europe, that you have to keep an eye on these things. You can't just set it and forget it, right? So with that in mind, I'm going to go through a couple of things here. So to answer a couple of questions, for example, what is the right mix of talent needed to run programmatic in-house, and what does it depend on? I'm going to break it out into two sections, right? One is your operating model choices, because there's many ways to go in-house, many different types of models. You can go all in, like for instance, Netflix full staff. You can use a three-legged stool approach, which I think is the primary approach of that 35% of the market that's gone in-house thus far, right? So that's with brand team, agency, and ad tech. And then finally, there's a new alternative out there that we'll describe as well. Second is the staffing in the programmatic management. So, there's key roles and there's tricks to the interview process to do it correctly. There's the programmatic manager skill gap. I have a slide on that. It's very important. And then there's around idea and staff management, right? So with that said, operating model choices. I'm going to show 3 broad choices here, but before I get into them, there's a framework that's really important. If you look at the way programmatic or advertising gets done in general, look at it from the perspective of 9 job steps, right? You start out with campaign objectives and you end with success metrics. In between, there's all these things that have to get done, right? And those things can be done in a variety of different ways. But the bookends, campaign objectives and success metrics, these must be owned independent of whatever in-house model or even non-in-house is chosen, right? Those have to be controlled. The middle can be outsourced. And you can run that 100% in-house. You can have that type of model. You have to hire staff, so there's different considerations there. You can run a 3-legged stool approach, but you got to mind the gaps, right? You have to still make sure that you own the campaign objectives or in good, tight collaboration with your partners, and that you own the underlying data and the success metrics to score the worthiness and the return of the campaign. Finally, you have this alternative model, which is a blend, and there's many hybrid approaches to do the steps in the middle. One of them that I think is going to become more popular over 2018 and 19 is for brands to stand up their own direct business process outsourcing or BPO teams. All of ad tech today, managed service, and many big agency managed service lean on outsourced services. And our argument from an economic and operational perspective says, why don't you just go do that directly? Because that provides in-house scale. It's folks that are off the books. And more importantly, it creates informational continuity as the team grows and as things evolve in programmatic. So team roles and cost reduction with scalable support. So let's look at these 3 key roles. They're broad roles, right? See, these aren't job descriptions, but it shows what you really must have. You got to have a great team manager. This person has great management skill, people management skill, has tremendous ecosystem knowledge, knows the supply chain inside and out, and can run a program and is great at project management. You have to have a data strategist on board in the in-house team, right? Proven data skills, so that has to be tested mathematically in order to make sure that the person really does have great data skills. They have to have bid log know-how. Ari's going to touch on that later on. And they must have measurement expertise, right? That's a key one. Finally, you have the planner. This person has great project management skills. This person's hands-on keyboards. All these people can be hands-on keyboards, but they might not necessarily be because other folks could be doing that. They have to have great ecosystem knowledge, and they have to know really well how to turn media buying and measurement expertise into structured use cases, right? Below this, what I mentioned earlier is the BPO support layer, right? Continuity, scalability. These are the folks that do a lot of heavy lifting, but they can only do so with great instructions. They can do campaign setup, trafficking, optimization, data gathering. And again, the cost advantages and the operational advantages of this system are tremendous. But again, it all starts with the 3 people up above, and most importantly, the team manager, which I'll get into right now. So management skill is tremendously important, big missing link in not only in the programmatic world, in the advertising world, but in the business world in general, right? It's why business schools have never fully succeeded, right? Because people management and leadership is the hardest thing to do, right? So what happens here is one day CMO wakes up, or a VP of digital, and they say, look, we have to go through a programmatic transformation. We have to get this right, independent of the model we choose. They realize that they have to then go through change management, which is largely about education, both internally and externally. And then they realize and they stumble upon, well, we need great programmatic management skills. So then how do we fill that gap quickly from a people perspective? And that really can only be done through applied education and a great interview process, right? Now, having a great programmatic manager is independent from whatever operating model is chosen. and it's definitely required for great hiring, whether it's internal or external. So this is really, really key. So keep that in mind. Now, once a manager is put in place, a model is chosen, and it's in operation, the ideas need to be surfaced and managed just as well as the people, internal or external. So we like to use a programmatic growth hacking approach. This is all just riffed upon Sean Ellis's work in the growth hacking world. You should check out his website. There's a lot of good stuff there. So create a lot of campaign use case ideas, structure them, right? With actors, data preconditions, criteria for success, and measures of success. There's an assumption behind every idea. That assumption needs to be tested. That hypothesis needs to be tested. So you test them and you run them on your platform, and then you manage ideas up or out. The ones that work, those are the ones that are growing the business. So lastly, and I'll turn this over to Ari, a little bit of a plug here, but we do really, really like what Beeswax has been doing since the company was founded and as it's grown. It's very important in the ecosystem because it's so different than every other DSP. Every other DSP that we can think of that's being used today is really an impenetrable DSP contract. So every problem is always going to look like percentage of media. What do we mean by that? The more impressions you buy with a legacy DSP, you have a rising dollar cost. It takes a long time to plateau on those costs, and the algo is probably not tuned the right way, as you've seen in a lot of Ad Exchanger and other articles on Digiday, et cetera. With Beeswax or any bidder as a service, you're regressing on your media cost, so the benefits happen much quicker, and the algo is tuned any way that you want it to be tuned. So we're very big fans of this, and we think that in order to really go in-house and get to that 2.0 alternative state of being, Beeswax is a great way to get there. Over to you guys.
We've talked about the strategy and the resources. Let's get into the tech. So when you're in-housing, you really have a lot of choices. There's a lot of DSPs out there, a lot of platforms. But ultimately, what you're trying to do with this, effectively an investment of your time and money, is get better results. And otherwise, there'd be no reason to do it. So here, I want to outline a couple of ways we think about the problem, and some advice on some of these issues. And then I'll talk about a very quick case study. So transparency is absolutely key. It's inherent in the strategy to in-house that you're trying to remove some opaqueness, remove some middlemen from the situation where you are potentially not getting the most out of your money. And so that's kind of table stakes, is full transparency on pricing. But it's important to also think about data transparency, and Tom touched on this a bit. But one of the real benefits to in-housing, of any degree of in-housing, is the ability to learn and to build a learning organization. And the way you do that is with data. There's just limits to what you can do if the output of your platform is entirely aggregated. And so with the modicum of effort, bringing in some of that raw data and understanding it is a really important aspect of in-housing. So flexibility and control are kind of two sides of the same coin. And it also relates to what I mentioned earlier, the idea of a learning organization. So when you in-house, what you inevitably do is learn every day. Either your in-house staff or your service providers are looking at data and trying to understand what's going on. And the outcome of that learning isn't academic, it's useful. You should be able to take that and flip it around and turn it into new experiments and techniques, be it something that's a marginal change on what you're doing, or something that is really a flyer, something totally new. To give one example, perhaps you're dabbling in mobile and you start saying, well, what if we did proximity, latitude, longitude type targeting? What if we did some sort of incentivized downloads? There's a million techniques out there. And when you're looking at a technology platform, you need to have confidence that whatever you throw at them, they're going to be able to catch, or at least help you work through the issues. And that goes for tech as well as the account management functions of those organizations. You need to be able to work as fast as you want to work. And then ultimately, the reason you're doing this is performance. And sure, there are KPIs, and every organization has their own. But when you're investing people and technology fees and your sizable media investments, you really want to add that all up and say, what's my ROAS, return on ad spend, that underlies some more individualized KPIs. So if I could be so bold, talk about some of the problems around each of these areas that we've seen or heard from the marketplace. Reach is an interesting factor in the market right now, where there's sort of a preconception that there's infinite reach, that there's infinite amount of inventory that is available in programmatic. First of all, it's not true when you start talking about quality and brand safe reach, but also we think it's a better idea to start saying, well, who has my audience? My audience is different from others' audiences. And that goes by channel, be it mobile, desktop, native, et cetera. But also it goes towards the ability to reach it without having your tech provider have some impediments between you and the reach that's out there, be it their business model or some of the kind of SPO stuff that's been going around where DSPs are kind of throttling traffic to save money. Optimization, I touched on this a bit earlier. Every company has their own KPIs, and there's no such thing as an optimization system that's just a black box that automatically provides those KPIs. You should think long and hard about how you can tailor the tech that someone brings to the table to reach the KPIs that are relevant to your business. If your conversions lag in time or are offline, for example, if your conversions are very mobile specific, is another example that comes up a lot, you need to be able to understand that you're going to have the data you need to optimize around that, and also that you can bring to the table whatever techniques you'd like to do for optimization, be it custom algorithms, the whole bring your own algorithm concept, or partners who have better mousetraps to produce the KPIs you need. Control and performance. This is kind of flip side of the slide earlier. It's like how do you move beyond the one size fits all technology that is offered to anyone who calls on a given tech vendor. How do you get data that you don't have, and so that you can get more control? Like, for example, loss reasons is a very, very esoteric concept. Is the ability to get data on why you lost individual auctions to be able to bid smarter. The ability to go a level deeper is really important because, as I've emphasized a couple of times, you're really looking at an investment to in-house, and you need to be able to get the return on that investment by constantly getting better at what you do. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So what you should look for is, on the reach side, the flip side of that is being able to tailor the supply and knowing that you're going to reach the people you want to reach. Either it's with exchange relationships, or it's with filtering that's very specific to your business. Optimization is an area with a lot of innovation going on right now in ad tech, and you should really look at platforms that will allow you to try different kinds of optimization, be it machine learning, AI, deep learning, as well as process automation. There are many vendors out there who are kind of doing things that enable the ad ops process to be much more efficient through APIs and other activities. On transparency, what you want to be able to get is raw data, so not just aggregated data. I've kind of beaten that point to death. And lastly, how do you know that you're going to be able to execute campaigns and activities that constantly give you better performance, because you have the data, you have the capabilities, you have the levers to pull, and potentially whether that is in-house staff or it's a supply vendor that you're working with. So with that, I want to go through a really quick case study. So there's a real case study, although we're not naming who it is. A major retailer here in the US who identified the problem, which was they were spending a lot of money on opaque channels for retargeting and for prospecting. And so the optimization wasn't tailored to them. The outcomes were good, but there was no way to really prove incrementality. And there's just a lot of margin being left around. And so what they did was, first they assembled a strategy. They brought together their leadership in data and in product management and engineering, and started understanding what assets they had and what their strategy would be. And the strategy was to look at replacing some aspects of their opaque spend with an in-house solution in order to recapture that margin. And what they discovered as well was that they had a lot of data to do this. So they had previously invested in a DMP-like solution that allowed them to capture user data and score it at a very granular level. And that data was actually fairly available in near real time based on the tech investment they'd previously made, which was, a great foundation. And based on that, they've actually had some interesting results. Reach is something that I've mentioned a couple of times, and where I think they were skeptical that by replacing a mainstream retargeting vendor that they'd be able to have as much reach because they didn't have all those header bidding and publisher relations. But by focusing on just the users they wanted to reach, they were able to increase the reach over their goal. And the ROAS was enormously higher by cutting out the margins of those opaque middlemen. So this is just one example, but it kind of takes you through each of those processes on strategy, tech, and execution that we've been talking about. And I think this is a pretty good way to think about things, even though every particular marketer might be a little bit different when they think about in-housing. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Julia for Q&A.
Okay, so we want to thank our panelists, Ari, as well as Wayne and Tom, for joining in on this presentation and providing their insights on very preliminarily how you take in programmatic in-house and apply that to the different business processes that you may already have established. So you can go ahead and use the Q&A box to ask any questions that you have for these panelists. We do have a few coming in that I'd like to address, and they'll be addressed to the different panelists. So if you have specific questions for any of them, please note that in the question box. Yes, we do have white papers available. We'll be sending out documentations other than API in the follow-up email that will be sent with the recording of this webinar. This is a question I'm going to ask to Ari. Are there examples or use cases of publishers taking control of their audiences by leveraging an in-house DSP/DMP?
That's a really great question, and we're actually seeing this a lot. So audience extension has been available through many platforms for years, but we're seeing many publishers who have unique audiences take it very seriously over the past year. And we're engaged with several. I don't have any names for you in terms of case studies, but really the question is, do you have, as a publisher, do you have audience that is uniquely valuable enough to be able to be used outside the context of your owned and operated properties? And if you do, you can think of a DSP as sort of replacing the buy side of the typical publisher ad server, the demand side of the publisher ad server. And it's definitely a good use case for many publishers.
Thanks, Ari.
And just to jump in, Julia, from a UK perspective, we have Auto Trader. It's one of the largest traffic generating auto sites, and Asda, which is the UK version of Walmart. And if you think about their big buyers of media, big sellers, and what they've done and they've talked about publicly is they've kind of consolidated the tech stack around both their needs. So clearly, on the seller side, you've got publisher ad server. On the buyer side, you've got an ad server for buyers. But actually, you can see synergies where they share data across the tech stack and then they use it to power buying and power selling. So there's actually a lot of interesting things you can do by doing that. But because the data is so sensitive, both of those have taken quite strong initiatives around owning it themselves. And if you look on Ad Exchanger and ExchangeWire and others, they talk about it. But I think if you're a big publisher, a big buyer with big publishing properties, you can really generate synergies by consolidating tech stack and thinking about data sharing across both.
Great, thanks, Wayne. And Wayne, I actually have another question for you, since this was something that was mentioned in your portion of the webinar. Can you give examples of programmatic print or out of home?
So programmatic print, it was done in Belgium, of all places. I'll try and find the exact example. And then programmatic out of home. In the UK, we've got Clear Channel, who are a very large provider of outdoor space. They're talking a lot about programmatic. And Google, if you Google double click out of home, they did a large programmatic out-of-home takeover at Waterloo Station, which is a large train station in the UK. So it's quite nascent. It is early days, but definitely digital out-of-home, particularly, is definitely becoming more. It's becoming connected programmatically.
And here in the U.S. there's V-Star Media, who we're not necessarily associated with, but they're here in New York and they sell digital out-of-home programmatically.
Tom, I'm going to ask this question to you and then also ask it to Ari as well to get a perspective on it, because I think it's a great question. What is your view on scale versus performance? Which one is more challenging to achieve?
When you, for scale, do you mean to scale up media buying?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, there's a couple ways to answer it. I mean, one, the economics of the way things work, right? So one of the biggest issues, you're seeing a lot of brand safety, a lot of fraud, issues, impression quality, et cetera. A lot of that is because of the size of the budgets that are being spent on a percentage of media basis, right? Once the budgets are cut, everybody pretty much knows how it works. The budget must get spent. And that might not be the best approach because you might be chasing diminishing returns. So around scale though, as far as, a in-house team being able to, achieve scale from a budget spend perspective, I don't see any issues with that. With respect to another aspect of scale is, if you spend 10 million on media a year and you have an in-house team, let's say you've hired, 4 or 5 people in-house inside the walls of the company. Well, if you double spend to 20 million, you don't need to double your team, right? That team of 4 or 5 can handle upwards of, probably 5, 10 times that amount, right? It's what's dependent there is not the dollar amount, it's the average size of the campaign and the number of campaigns, because then that trickles down to, setting up things in a platform with line items, trafficking, et cetera. But overall, an in-house team can achieve whatever the scale can be achieved in whatever the status quo model is, but with a lot more efficiency probably.
I'm going to ask that same question to Ari. Great answer, Tom. What is your view on scale versus performance? Which one is more challenging to achieve?
Well, the challenge is to achieve both. One or the other is easy, right? What we see a lot, especially with folks who are looking at very custom optimization capabilities or custom KPIs, is that they can deliver those at small scale, but then scaling them up is difficult because necessarily you're starting to apply the model to inventory or users or data that is less targeted. So this is not a in-housing problem. This is kind of a fundamental law of advertising.
Yeah.
It's the speed limit. You can't do both.
All right, well, we've come to the end of our questions for today. We thank you all for staying on for so long and joining us for this webinar. If you have any additional questions for any of the panelists, please feel free to reach out to them. We'll be following up again with the recorded version of this webinar and additional resources for each of the panelist companies. Thank you for attending today and have a great day.